Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom, and in today's video, I am joined by Dr. Roland Millare. Dr. Millare, how are you doing today?
Doing well. Thank you for having me on today, Don.
Anytime, of course. So, Dr. Millare, I'm going to go ahead and introduce him for the audience, and then we're going to talk about his book called "A Living Sacrifice: Liturgy and Eschatology" in Joseph Ratzinger. Strongly recommend this book if you guys are frequent viewers of my channel. It's an excellent book on Pope Benedict's liturgical theology. But before any further ado, let me go ahead and introduce our guest. Uh, Dr. Roland Millare, a native Houstonian, serves as the Vice President of Curriculum and the Director of Clergy Initiatives for the John Paul II Foundation in Houston, Texas. Dr. Millare served as a member of the Theology Department at St. John the 23rd College Preparatory in Katy, Texas, for over 15 years. He received a BA in Theology from Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio. He has an MA in Theological Studies with a concentration in Moral Theology from the Notre Dame Graduate School of Christendom College in Alexandria, Virginia, and a licentiate, STL, and doctorate in Sacred Theology, STHD, in Dogmatic Theology with a specialization in Sacramental Theology from the University of St. Mary of the Lake in Mundelein, Illinois. Dr. Millare also serves as an adjunct professor of theology for permanent deacon candidates, seminarians, undergraduate, and graduate students at the University of St. Thomas, St. Mary's Seminary, the Diocese of Fort Worth, and the University of Dallas. He has published various theological articles for Logos, Antiphon, New Black Friars, Nova et Vetera, the Haythrop Journal, and the Word on Fire Evangelization and Culture Journal. He has published the book A Living Sacrifice, Liturgy and Eschatology in Joseph Ratzinger from Emmaus Academic in 2022. And Dr. Millare has also contributed an article to a forthcoming lexicon on the theology of Joseph Ratzinger by Ignatius Press. Finally, Dr. Millare is a member of the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars, Academy of Catholic Theology, and the Society for Catholic Liturgy. Dr. Millare enjoys the gift of life and love with his beautiful wife, Veronica, and their 3 children. So once again, Dr. Millare, welcome on the Logos Project.
Yes, thank you again for having me, Don.
So, so I read your book a couple months ago, and I really enjoyed it. And I think, unfortunately, the liturgy is a very divisive topic. So, I'm not interested in creating more divisiveness, but just in exploring the mind of Pope Benedict, of Joseph Ratzinger, when it comes to his understanding of the theology of the liturgy, how his book, especially The Spirit of the Liturgy, is kind of a taking up of Romano Guardini's Spirit of the Liturgy. And in light of Ratzinger's context, what he contributed to the theology of sacred liturgy. So maybe as an opening kind of guiding question, could you, so the main thrust of your book is it's basically an argument for the primacy of logos over ethos. Now, can we maybe open up by explaining what this actually means before we get into more details?
Sure, right. Especially, for the viewers, listeners, you have these $50 words we throw out there, right? Logos, ethos.
Yeah.
What do these words mean? So, in Guardini's Spirit of the Liturgy, written in the early part of the 20th century, I forget now, maybe 1918 comes to mind, but that might be wrong. Um, but there's a chapter on the primacy of logos over ethos, and you see that phrase used throughout Ratzinger and Benedict's writings. I mean, that word logos, right? Obviously, it's influenced the project that you are undertaking of this show, right? The Greek
Yes.
word logos simply means word, reason, or meaning.
Mhm.
Ethos, habit, custom, ethic. We have this adage in theology, right? Agere sequitur esse, right? Action follows being. It's another way of getting at that relationship between logos and ethos, right? Logos is that being, right? Ethos is that action that follows from it. So, with
Oh,
respect to Guardini and then by extension Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, he says the priority has to be first and foremost on the logos, which informs the ethos. And what I've come up with, right? Continue to reflect on, the writings of Guardini and Ratzinger, Benedict, and Pieper and John Paul II and others, is this consistency in pushing forward this idea that the logos, the ultimate meaning or word, is communion. That's what we're made for, right? That's our anthropology. The I is made for a communion with another. In fact, in the spirit of the liturgy, Guardini's spirit of the liturgy, I mean, Romano Guardini writes that the liturgy doesn't say I, but says we, right? We
Mhm.
subordinate that individual I towards this larger we or communion. And so, if that's the case, then the the ethos that flows from that, this notion of communion, is self-giving love. I mean, to highlight the distinction, I mean, our present culture pushes forward the logos of individualistic autonomy. I am this isolated, autonomous individual. I'll do what I want, when I want, with whom I want. Well, if that's the case, then the ethos that flows out of that is utility, right? I will simply act based not on self-giving love, but on utility, right, or use of another. And that's kind of the, you know, I mean, you see this trope throughout the work, right? The notion of the primacy of logos over ethos, and this really is one of the keys in which we can enter into the vast symphony of Ratzinger's theology. Because as you know, right, as a student of Ratzinger and Benedict XVI, right, his theology can be quite complicated in part because it's not systematic in the way in which people would like. Right? I mean,
Yeah.
part of that is given his history, right? I mean, he didn't, you know, yes, he was a paratus of the council, right, a priest, right, but soon a bishop, and then eventually spent most of his life, right, as the head of
Mhm.
the what was then the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, and so his theology was developed in spurts, but by that I mean, varying essays and books. But if you were to take those 85 or 86 books and those hundreds of articles, I mean, it's 16 volumes, many of which
Mhm.
multiple books in them. So there is quite a bit of
Yeah.
theology in there. And so how do you get into kind of uniting the symphony? I have found that this notion of the primacy of logos over ethos is one of those ways. In particular, in
Yeah.
my case, right, focusing in on the relationship between liturgy and eschatology, because when you subordinate logos to ethos, right? You put ethos first, things go wrong. With respect to liturgy, it becomes something that's man-made, something I can manufacture. It ceases to become, the work of God and becomes more the work of man. We take that notion of, liturgy as work of the people, and then we run with it into I can shape and reshape the liturgy how I want, when I want. I mean, and something similar happens with respect to eschatology. When I emphasize ethos over logos, then it becomes about the realization of the kingdom here and now, and then there tends to be this displacement of the church with politics, and so we
Yeah.
need to hold these things in tandem, right, via the primacy of the logos, and seeing there is this relationship between liturgy and eschatology, and so that's really at the heart of the work.
Wow, that's a yeah, incredible synthesis. I completely agree with you. That's great. Yeah, no, that's definitely a theme that because I remember reading about so I was reading a dissertation on Ratzinger's eschatology, and it was by Patrick Fletcher, called Resurrection Realism, and he makes a lot of excellent points. And overall, I think he's correct that there's a trajectory in Ratzinger's understanding of the relationship between well the New Testament and Plato, and the Greek and the Hebrew elements in his understanding of the resurrection. But I feel like Fletcher reads a little too much into it, this kind of beginning with what we would say is the priority of ethos in Ratzinger, and then eventually he comes to the priority of logos. But that's not what I've found in when I'm reading him. I found, especially in his book, Theological Highlights of the Council, I mean, he criticizes a certain spirit of kind of man-made progression, kind of political, trajectory after the council that is there in his writings from the beginning. So, you know, what you said really is interesting, because it seems to me that there's no getting around the priority of logos, even when we try to make everything about ethos, because that just speaks another kind of logos. which is the logos of, ultimate ethos, really. And Ratzinger, in my reading, is really he's got a chip on his shoulder, and I think rightfully so, when it comes to Karl Marx, who kind of reduces, the what you call in your book the homo adorans to the homo faber, and this comes up in his introduction to Christianity. And anyway, so I really like, that's why I really appreciated your book. You kind of show how from beginning to end, Ratzinger has this understanding of the priority of logos and the centrality of Christ, really, and this concept of communion, which is the I think the hermeneutic of the Second Vatican Council. But anyway, so that being said, I kind of wanted to ask you about, um, specifically Ratzinger's. So we talked about this priority of the logos, but maybe kind of thinking of it in terms of the centrality of logos in his theology. So how Jesus Christ, as the logos incarnate, is at the heart of his symphony, really. And I think you draw that out in how you connect liturgy, eschatology, and ecclesiology in your book. Could you maybe just kind of talk more about this centrality of Jesus Christ, if that
Yeah.
makes
So
sense?
on the one hand, yeah, sure. I mean, the logos, right? I mean, we've laid out it means word, reason, or meaning, but then that logos has a face and a name, right? The logos, the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and so that's why, I mean, in Ratzinger's writings, you'll see, you know, not a conflation, but really, I mean, we're called not only to just know the logos, but we're called to love the logos, because the logos
Mhm.
is a person, and hence
Yeah.
that Christocentric thrust. I mean, if you look at his commentary on Gaudium et Spes, right? On the different commentaries in Vatican II,
Hmm.
Joseph Ratzinger famously wrote an essay on Gaudium et Spes, and he's highly critical of that particular document for being Pelagian and overly optimistic, so on and so forth. But what he does highlight is that for the first time, the magisterium in a document is overtly Christocentric, right? Gaudium et Spes
Yeah.
22, right? That Jesus Christ fully reveals the person to himself, and makes his supreme calling clear. And so you see that same sort of Christocentric thrust throughout his theology. In fact, Father
Hmm.
Emery de Gaulle has written of course I can't think of the name of his book right now, but I mean, he has done a great job, along with Tracy Rowland, and Father Pablo Sarto, right, emphasizing that Christocentrism in Ratzinger's thought.
Hmm.
And you see this in I can't think of the name of the work now, but it's a series of essays on the liturgy, A New Song for the Lord. One of
Oh,
the
yes.
essays in there, yeah, in A New Song for the Lord, is essentially about that need to connect Christology and liturgy, right? I mean, these
Hmm.
things are inseparable. I think it's part of the problem in modern theology and contemporary theology. We're so over specialized that
Yeah.
we forget about the whole, and that's, I think, what's important about a thinker like Ratzinger, right? I mean, he
Hmm.
reminds us about the need to engage the whole symphony, beginning with its Christological center. This comes out in Behold the Pierced One, right? His
Yes.
series of essays reflecting on this notion of spiritual Christology, right? That I am, you know, uh, essentially Christ's life needs to become my life. I mean, you see this beautifully outlined in the writings, for example, Blessed Columba Marmion and others, right? And it's via the liturgy that I have access to Christ's life, right? Even now, we're in the midst of Holy Week, right? This is that
Yeah.
culminating week where we're called to not just passively remember or celebrate the mysteries, we're called to enter into them, right? These mysteries are meant to become our mysteries. And
Hmm.
throughout Ratzinger's writings with respect to spiritual Christology, he emphasizes what is translated in English as pro-existence.
Yeah.
That word pro, right? I mean, it's the Latin word for. Christ lives for others, right? I mean, Jesus says, "This is my body given up for you." And
Yeah.
so, I mean, that notion of his life becoming mine, I'm called to enter into his life of self-sacrificial love. So once again, that ethos of self-giving love. And then this connects then to the church, right? The church is meant to take up that mission of self-giving love, that mission of charity. The
Hmm.
problem, as we know in our times, is we want to entrust charity to the state, right, as opposed to justice, right, when we need to flip flop things, right. It's not that the church should not be concerned with justice, but when she becomes
Hmm.
concerned with justice over charity, then we run into problems. And so really, I mean, that Christological center, that Christocentrism in Ratzinger consistently helps to bring about a balance that's necessary in my view.
Yeah, no, I mean, and this permeates really Spe Salvi and Caritas in Veritate. This especially Caritas in Veritate talks about justice without charity. It can't truly be just, but this kind of spills into the question about social justice and the role of the church, and of course eschatology, and that you draw this out in your book. Um, the role of the church isn't to make the world into a utopia through social justice, even though justice is very important, but it's rather to remind humanity of the logos from which a proper ethos can flow. And it seems to me that's why the liturgy has a priority in his understanding of church reform. And you definitely see this in Caritas and Spe Salvi as well, because in Spe Salvi he has Karl Marx in mind, and Marxism is a very powerful. It has a very powerful appeal to modern man, precisely because the eclipse of God. There, if God can't make the world a better place, then it's up to us. So anyway, and that ties into, and you talk about the liberation theology. So that I wanted to ask you more about this theology of hope, because I know his colleague Jean-Baptiste Metz, um, I don't believe saw eye to eye with him in the details when it comes to the proper stance when it comes to Christian hope. Like, should it take a more activist approach, or should it be more grounded in the liturgy, really, and in that charity, that pro-existence that overflows from the sacrifice of the Mass? So could you maybe talk more about this theology of hope?
Yeah, the way I get at it is, there's the starting line in Deus Caritas S, his Pope Benedict's
Hmm.
first encyclical. I think it's number 14, right? And it says it's sort of a somewhat of a paraphrase, right? A Eucharist which does not pass over into a concrete expression, of love for neighbor is
Hmm.
intrinsically fragmented. I mean,
Yeah,
that has huge
yeah,
implications, right? I mean, the Eucharist is somehow incomplete if it just, if what happens at the Mass doesn't translate into, my love for the other, and prima facie it seems, this is wrong, this isn't right. But then
hmm,
when you just think about the fact that, what are the two greatest commandments? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. And the second commandment is like unto it: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And in Deus Caritas
yeah,
S, he presents Saint Teresa of Calcutta as this model, right? Mother
yeah,
Teresa, the missionaries of charity. They have daily mass, daily holy hour, and then they're engaged in that charitable work, right? And if you look at Spe Salvi, right, he talks about a hope that just isn't informative but performative, right? It actually,
yeah,
does something. And if you think of some of the divisions in the church, you have people that are on the one hand only interested in piety, reverent liturgy, beauty, and then on the other hand, you have people that are only interested in so-called social action, social justice. Never
yeah,
the two shall meet. But yet, this is foreign to the tradition. I mean, St. John Chrysostom, he gives this beautiful homily where he basically says, look, you adorn Christ, you know, uh, and his altar, and rightfully so. But yet, when you encounter Christ, that same Christ in the corner of the street, among the poor, you neglect him, right? It's not consistent, right? It's not a true
yeah,
Eucharistic life. I mean, that's what Saint Augustine gets at, right? I mean, become like that which you have received. I mean, the whole. I mean, and that's really. I mean, when Saint Peter says, to give an apologia, a reason for our hope, the best way we do this is by by living this out, right? And so both, I would say, Metz, Moltmann, and Ratzinger, right? They are concerned with, they have that same end or interest in unity and concrete expression of charity. But for Ratzinger, right, I mean, he wants to maintain that primacy of the logos. It should first and foremost begin in the liturgy, right? And hence that notion from Romans 12, verse 1, right? The Logic latreia, right? Because St. Paul there says, make of your bodies a living sacrifice. So he's not talking about the mass. He's talking about something
Mhm.
that's outside of the mass, but yet at the same time should be intimately connected with it. And that is our lives, right? Our Christian lives should be rooted in the liturgy in such a way that charity flows out of it. That is a concrete expression of hope, properly ordered, beginning first with God, right, and then um, and then our neighbor, right, in that vertical
Yeah.
communion first and foremost, and then the horizontal, right. But when you want to start with the horizontal, with with the other, with the person, it ends up devolving. It ends up being about political action. It ends up being about political utopia as opposed to the kingdom of God, right. And that's the worry.
Yes, yes, and I think this is really what some of the critics of Pope Benedict miss is that a lot of times you hear he's not concerned with social justice and making the world a better place, and because he's too concerned with the liturgy, which like how does that make the world a better place, you know? And how does the church, how is she reformed? We need to do this, and all these programs of action and all these bureaucracies and meetings but really what he's saying is that if we get the logos right, then the ethos will actually flow from it in a way that has its proper orientation, unlike this kind of immanent closed in frame. And that no, this is just a kind of intuition I have. So I think there was a little bit of this individualistic piety that saw the mass as a sacrifice, and rightfully so, but merely as a sacrifice. And because of the individualism, maybe what was overshadowed was the communal aspect that you talked about, the flowing out into the ethos, into the neighbor. And so when Guardini writes about this, he wants to emphasize the meal aspect of the mass, precisely, drawing on St. Augustine, how the Eucharist is the sacrament of charity, and it actually effects the communion of the church, as St. Thomas talks about as well. Now, and so that's kind of a corrective I see on Guardini's side, to try to remember people that the Eucharist is not just an individualistic bank of graces, right? That you kind of go to punch in your card, but it's really something that does, involve hope, charity, and ethos. But Ratzinger wants to say, however, after all of this, talk that Guardini began, and after the aftermath of the council, the mass got reduced to being perceived again within this immanent frame as merely a celebration of the community, merely as a meal, and the sacrifice aspect was eclipsed. Now, that doesn't mean that the missal itself has sacrificial language. I'm not disparaging the missal at all. I think the Novus Ordo is a beautiful iteration of the Roman liturgy, but in practice it does seem to be this kind of obfuscation of the primacy of sacrifice. So maybe could we unpack, in light of what we've been saying, like how Ratzinger wants to make sure we don't lose that primacy of sacrifice, how it's precisely the vertical that makes the horizontal possible. Without transcendence, we're just going to start worshiping ourselves. Could you talk more about
Mhm.
that?
Sure. I mean, the spirit of the liturgy, right? He emphasizes the model of the golden calf as kind of the um, you know, anti liturgical, in the sense of, the liturgy is first and foremost the Opus Dei, the work of God. We receive this logos, as
Mhm.
opposed to we created ourselves. And whereas, in Exodus, the creation of the golden calf represents that anti worship, because it's all
Mhm.
about self affirmation. But you can continue to see that same mindset re-echoed in how people celebrate the liturgy, right? They will kind of take the liturgy and then they will reshape it into their own image. And
Mhm.
this is the shortcoming of how the Novus Ordo has been implemented, or how the Missal of Paul VI and St. John Paul II has been received. Right, people take some legitimate options, and then they run with illegitimate ones. Right, they take the whole notion that there are options available to them, and then they say, well, if you can have options here, why not there? And then you have sometimes committees, or sometimes the individual celebrant, right, who just does all these sort of things, right? And then at the end of the day, what is that, right? That's a affirmation of ethos, or the ethos of an individual or a liturgy committee or a parish over the logos of the church. And you see that again and again, right?
Hmm.
When you want authentic obedience, not in terms of kind of rigidity to rubrics, right? But a fidelity to the law which the church has given to us, because it guides us, and really and frees us.
Hmm.
I'm trying to think where I was going with this. Yeah, but modern, modern culture wants to say no. We just kind of do what we want, when we want, who
Hmm.
we want, and that enters, unfortunately, even into the liturgy. And then hence
Yeah.
why we have this extreme, right? Well, then let's just reject the present missal altogether, right? Because it must be then
Yeah.
the fault of the present missal, and then so we want to go back to the missal of St. John the 23rd, or the TLM, depending on how to frame it, because it gives us
Yeah.
these rules which we can deviate from. That's an oversimplification of
No, that makes
a
sense.
larger issue. Yeah,
And that's
and
why I
you may not want to go there, but
yeah, well, that's why I appreciate the title of his book, The Spirit of the Liturgy, because what's a reform, a liturgical reform in the church is not really. He says this in Feast of Faith, right? It's not about this or that missal, or this or these rubrics. It's really about understanding that we don't form the liturgy. The liturgy forms us. And so it seems to me that a lot of times when I try not to do it as much as I can, but when I enter into debates over liturgy, I often realize that the arguments are sometimes, well, I prefer this, it fosters my devotion better,
Mhm.
or this or that. And I don't want to disparage people's devotional lives at all, but I think that, again, that's that turning into self, that immanent frame, that it's not really about what I prefer, but it's kind of like how he opens Spirit Liturgy, which is the Mount Sinai being the paradigm where God gives us through the church. And that's also why I would say, just rejecting the missal and going back to the missal of John the 23rd is just another symptom of the same problem. And that's my interpretation, but ultimately it has to do with, it's not really about preference, but it's about allowing to be formed by the church. And if we get that right, then all of these abuses, will be reoriented, and man will be turned towards the Lord again and not towards himself. Anyway, and that kind of
Yeah, and
brings me.
that's pretty much where, that's pretty much where, where I am, right? If we get the logos right, and you made this point, right? We'll get the ethos right,
Yeah.
and this is really what, that's why his work takes on the same title as that of Guardini, right? It's about the
Hmm.
spirit of the liturgy, or if you want, it's about the spirit of the liturgical movement. And with respect
Yes.
to the liturgical movement, they were interested in people, actually participating in the sacred liturgy. And
Hmm.
what people always forget is there was a close connection with, you know, interest in the liturgy and social action, right? We forget that the venerable, or the servant of God, Dorothy Day, for example, right? She was very much
Hmm.
shaped by, the writings of Virgil Michael, and influenced by the liturgical movement. Or just look at, the American Benedictine, Virgil Michael, right? And look at
Hmm.
his writings on liturgy and on social action, right? The idea of opposing these things would never have crossed
Right.
their minds. And so, to my mind, that's why Ratzinger Benedict offers us a moment to recover, the
Hmm.
liturgical movement, or what he refers to as a new liturgical movement, right?
Yes.
Properly
Yeah.
understood. So,
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. And so from your book, what I gathered was that, it's, in fact, in a certain sense, it's precisely because of a reduction to a kind of individualistic approach to the sacrifice of the mass, that it kind of flipped sided, right? It flipped into this communal, imminent, celebration of the community. But if we get the priority of the sacrifice, then the meal follows from that. The communion between believers is only possible truly if the sacrifice is there to make it possible. And so I think that definitely restoring that priority of the sacrifice, not over and against the meal, or the meal over and against the sacrifice, is precisely what Ratzinger wants to do, to show us that, this social justice, this communion with all men, is made possible by the coexistence of Jesus. And so anyway, that's what I really liked about the focus in your book. But I wanted to ask you about maybe just a little bit more on the relationship between, I guess we've kind of been talking about this, right? The political ethics and eschatology. The church isn't in the business of, uh, you know, um, m- politically controlling the world, nor is politics in the business of ushering in a utopia, a heaven on earth, by its own means. But the church gives politics the ethos that flows from the logos that it proclaims. Is kind of the way I see it. But maybe talk about more about Logic of Latria. This is from Romans 1 in Paul's letter. He talks about this worship according to the logos. How does that look like in our everyday lives, if that makes sense, as Christians?
Sure. Yeah. So in Romans 12 verse 1, right there at the very beginning, right, St. Paul says, I urge you, um, I'll read this. I urge you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship, right? So there's that phrase, logic latria, is we render it, spiritual worship. I mean, literally, it would be worship according to the logos, right? And then it'll go on, right? St. Paul in verse 2 will say, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, so you may discern what is the will of God, what is good, acceptable, and perfect. And so, what we're called to do, we've been talking about, right, with respect to pro-existence, we're called to enter into his sacrifice. We want Christ to logify us, right? That is, his sacrifice, becomes ours, right? Well, I mean, what does that look like on a practical level, right? I mean, you think about, a sacrifice that a spouse, makes for the other, right, so that they might do particular things with respect to further study, or
Hmm.
with respect to their job, right? Maybe a wife travels for work, or the husband, vice versa, right? Or the sacrifice a parent makes, right, getting up in the middle of the night, right, to tend to a sick child, right? I mean, too often we look for sacrifice in these extraordinary moments, but they're really found in the ordinary and the everyday, right? What Pope Francis speaks about in terms of the middle class holiness, right? It's just
Yeah.
found in the it's found in the mundane, right? I mean, we don't have to go far to encounter them. And so, just taking I mean, basically, our lives as Christians must be an extension of the mass, right? That's what St. Paul's getting at. But you see this portrayed in the early church, right? When St. Polycarp was, you know, being prepared to be martyred, right? They smelled baking bread, like the bread used for the Eucharist. Or think about St. Ignatius of Antioch, right? He uses this Eucharistic imagery in relationship to his martyrdom, right? He desires to be crushed like the wheat that's crushed with respect to the Eucharist, right? I mean, a part of
Yeah.
the problem with our present day is we want to separate everyday life from liturgy, from the sacraments, and then
Yeah.
we wonder why we treat the Eucharist like a vitamin, right? It's
Yeah.
and this is the
Yeah.
problem, right? We separate the two, right? When we're called to this sacramental life, which integrates the two, and so then this has implications for politics, right? I mean, with respect to politics, right? In Spe Salvi and in his work on eschatology, I mean, Benedict Ratzinger, I mean, talks about politics is about ethics and not eschatology. And we have to
Hmm.
separate, that has to be our priority, to
Yeah.
separate eschatology from politics. Because what do you end up with, right? You end up with a certain political messianism. And
Yeah.
frankly, if you look now, you look at the way campaigns are running, regardless of political party, they're
Yeah.
all run on these very much these kind of messianic platforms. And in the
Yeah.
apps, I mean, with the eclipse of God and people not fully invested in their faith, you could see why they make this into their religion. They're consumed by it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It displaces authentic faith, and so they're no longer living their lives as living sacrifices. And then so you could see how the Eucharist just it becomes more palatable for it to become this fraternal meal, right? It's just
Yeah.
easier, right? It makes less demands. We can all just show up as individuals to the party and engage in the fraternal meal. Whereas if it's a sacrificial meal, it has different
Yeah.
requirements and expectations that I must meet.
That's very helpful. I feel like, yeah, it's a very astute description of certain American mentalities. I mean, because politics is the religion of Americans, I think, nowadays. And so
Yes.
it makes sense that if that's their religion, well, then the mass is a kind of identifier. I'm not a communist, or, I'm part of this group and I vote for this person, and, we celebrate our solidarity. But no, so that's
And
very
then it's
helpful.
and then and it's reflected right in the Ars Celebrandi, right? I mean, the music
Yeah.
becomes about celebrating us, right? Let us build the city of God, right? You and
Hmm.
I are the bread of life, right? All of these songs,
Hmm.
as opposed to raising our sights above, they are you know directed below. Or think about I mean, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, right? And so I
Hmm.
went through that period where we want to put carpet in the sanctuary. We want to put in fake ficus plants to make it more like a living room, make you feel at home, and less
Yeah.
of this kind of otherworldly, transcendent, eschatological imagery. But
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
what ends up happening, right? It affects how we worship, and so as opposed to liturgy informing our culture, we allow the culture to shape our liturgy, which is
Hmm.
problematic. So,
No, absolutely. So this kind of leads me towards a topic that's, I don't think it needs to be so controversial, but it is, and it's really in the spirit of liturgy. Joseph Ratzinger talks about the ad orientem posture of the priest during the Eucharistic liturgy. Um, and so, of course, during the liturgy of the word, the priest faces the people because he's addressing them with the word of God, and they respond. And it's during the canon that he'll face God with the people and facing east. And I had a section here in your book, if you don't mind me reading it. It was on page 237. You wrote that Ratzinger concludes this orientation towards the temple, and thus the connection of the synagogue's liturgy of the word with the sacrificial liturgy of the temple. So here he's talking about the Jewish worship, can be seen in its form of prayer. Ratzinger develops the synagogue's close connection to the sacrificial worship of the temple as he stresses the continuity in the Eucharist with both worship in the synagogue and sacrifice in the temple. In the temple. So here you kind of see Ratzinger, kind of showing us the origins of liturgy of the Word and liturgy of the Eucharist. But then you say the close relationship between the synagogue and the temple also serves as the foundation for Ratzinger to argue for the continuity in worship and the construction of churches ad orientem, because Christ is the living temple that fulfills the hope, here's that key term, hope, left by the absence of the Ark of the Covenant. The altar maintains a prominent position within the church building, highlighting the liturgy's primary purpose to represent the paschal sacrifice of Christ. The emphasis on the altar as the eschatological focal point implies that the sanctuary and the church itself should be constructed to underscore this end. Church architecture must highlight this orientation towards Christ as the true oriens and as the sacrificial lamb. Beyond these general principles, Ratzinger leaves the applications of these theological foundations undeveloped. So, my point really in reading that section of your book was that there's a rich theology behind this posture, which is not throughout the whole mass, but it's precisely when we approach the centrality of the sacrifice, that the priest will face the rising sun. And it's precisely everything we've talked about, up till now, has to do with the outpouring of the ethos from the Logos, which is that when we center on Christ, we're centering on the Logos. So we get that first. And then after that, the priest turns around and sends us out on mission to, implement the sacrifice that we've been facing. And so if the priest is facing towards the people during this sacrificial moment, the church allows it, and Pope Benedict talked about having the cross in the middle to have a kind of inner ad orientem, a liturgical ad orientem. I'm not disparaging any of that, but the logic, the theologic, right, of what he's saying here is that there's something in the liturgy about the orients that actually is undergirded by this primacy of the Logos that makes genuine community possible. And I think losing that actually bespeaks to all those things we've talked about when it comes to this immanent frame, to the celebration of the culture and of the self. So that would kind of be what I've gathered from what you're saying and from Ratzinger on his critique of a kind of hasty switching things, if that makes sense. Anything you wanted to say about that?
Yeah, no. I mean, what comes to mind, I can't think of the name of the author, but it's in the book "Why Catholics Can't Sing." Right? You turn the priest around,
Yeah.
you give him a microphone, and a star is born.
Hmm.
That's the great temptation, right? I mean, there's nothing.
Hmm.
I mean, yes, I've seen. Liturgy I've experienced many times offered versus populum. In fact,
Yeah.
our holy fathers have offered, liturgies versus populum. However,
Mm.
right, I mean, the tradition has been, that goes back, right, thousands of years to offer, liturgy ad orientem towards the east. And this is still done by many of the Eastern churches. This is certainly done in, when liturgy is celebrated according to the Missal of St. John the 23rd. And then, those who celebrate the Missal of Divine Worship, the Missal, right? The Anglicans and
Hmm.
Episcopalians who have entered back into full communion under the personal ordinariate of the chair of St. Peter or Our Lady of Walsingham.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, that being said, there is something to be, I mean, to your point, I mean, throughout the liturgy, there was this phrase, right? Conversi ad Dominum, right? Turn towards
Yeah.
the Lord. And there's something beautiful symbolically about the priest, the minister, and the people all facing the same direction towards Christ, who
Mm.
comes again on the altar. Christ, who is, yes, present in the Eucharist and the tabernacle, but Christ, who is being made present in the Holy Eucharist, and the shepherd, leads the way, right? And there's also a moral symbol there, right? There is this need for all of us. I mean, the word convert, right? Conversion, metanoia, right? There's this need for us to turn around, and so there's something
Yeah.
beautiful about during that liturgy of the Eucharist, all of us oriented towards Christ together. It's a symbolic, physical act reminding us that we need to all orient ourselves back to Christ. The problem
Yeah.
is, and then we alluded to this before we started, right? I mean, people have lost that sense of symbol, right? This is
Hmm.
something that Romano Guardini, I think in this 1964 letter to the German bishops who were gathered for a liturgy conference in Mainz, right?
Hmm.
Basically he raises the question, right? Is the modern person capable of worship, because the modern person doesn't understand symbols, right? And if we don't
Yeah.
understand symbols, can we, effectively engage? But to your point, I mean, I think there is a need for the recovery of, worship ad orientem. Now, I'm fortunate. I mean, I'm in a parish that's in, suburban Houston in Sugarland, where
Hmm.
it's it's ordinary form, right? Mass celebrated according to the Pauline Missal in English, sometimes in Latin, and half the time it's celebrated ad orientem, and so it's just become
Hmm.
normative for me to experience liturgy ad orientem.
Yeah.
But you see the beauty of it, right? We turn towards Christ, and then to the point you made, right? Then we go, right? You are set, right? You've
Hmm.
had your focused on me. Now I send you forth to go out there in the world to be, be the Eucharist, right? In the midst of the culture we live in, right?
Yeah, no, to me it seems it's the logic of the Hallel songs, the songs of ascent, right? It's the logic of Sinai. You go up to the Lord and then you are sent out, and it's the logic of, the transfiguration, all the mountains in Scripture. It's, the church is a pilgrim people in the desert Exodus, Numbers. All of our tradition is rich with this turning, this conversion, this faith that implies repentance and all that kind of stuff. And not to be overly controversial, but I do think actually this could be a good fraternal criticism of people who are upset about the liturgical abuses. They, in the name of Adoration, might actually turn in on themselves as well. And so that could be something maybe to watch out for, which is this kind of self-enclosed circle, right? A friend of mine described it that way, that can paradoxically show up, when the liturgy is weaponized because of discontent. But conversely, I have had some people, say to me that, it's okay to change this because modern man is not someone who is he doesn't read the symbols of the past in the same way today, and so symbols can change and mean different things. But that goes back to, and so that's why the priest could just face the people throughout the whole mass. But that goes back to what you said about Guardini, and I was reading Pope Francis's Desiderio Desideravi. I got it right. And he had some things to say in here that I think are important, because he talks about precisely the fact that modern man doesn't understand these symbols, and shouldn't just change them to ones he understands, but actually recover a proper understanding of these symbols. So if you don't mind, I just have a couple quotes here that I think are really pertinent. In paragraph 42 of Desiderio, Pope Francis says the liturgy is done with things that are the exact opposite of spiritual abstraction. So we have bread, wine, oil, water, ashes, body, words, silences, gestures, space, time, light. And he says the whole of creation is a manifestation of the love of God, and from when that same love was manifested in its fullness in the cross of Jesus, all of creation was drawn toward it. There's this drawing. And then in paragraph 46, to Christ, the sacraments are oriented, which is where we get the terminology of oriens. And last two sections here that I just thought were very perspicacious is in paragraph 44, he says, to have lost the capacity to grasp the symbolic value of the body and of every creature renders the symbolic language of the liturgy almost inaccessible to the modern mentality. And yet there can be no question of renouncing such language. It cannot be renounced because it is how the Holy Trinity chose to reach us through the flesh of the Word. It is rather a question of recovering the capacity to use and understand the symbols of the liturgy. And then last paragraph in 47, he says, from that moment forward, that gesture, its symbolic force is ours. It belongs to us. So now here he's not talking about Adorantem specifically, but the principle. And he says, or better said, we belong to it. It gives us form. We are formed by it. It's not personal preference. It is not necessary to have understood everything in that gesture. What is needed is being small, both in consigning it and in receiving it. The rest is the work of the Spirit. In this way, we are initiated into symbolic language. We cannot let ourselves be robbed of such richness. Growing up, we will have more ways of being able to understand, but always on the condition of remaining little ones. So this is from Pope Francis's Desiderio Desideravi. And so I just kind of wanted to point some of my listeners to that letter on the liturgy, which I thought was very beautiful, very rich, a lot of Guardini in it. And that this argument that because modern man has evolved and is beyond the symbols of the past that we can now dismiss with certain things, I don't think is Pope Francis wouldn't agree with that. And so anyway, the point being is that based
Yeah,
on everything.
because where does it stop, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if we apply that to ad orientem, I mean, why not certain vestments, right? I mean, these
Yes.
don't mean these. I mean, these this meant something to Romans in first century AD, but what do they mean to someone in America in the 21st
Hmm.
century, right? I mean, it seems
Yeah.
so foreign. So why not adapt those, right? I mean, yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, what we need, and this is the a point highlighted in Desiderio Desideravi is liturgical formation, liturgical
Yes.
catechesis,
Hmm.
and the great thing now is we have access to all kinds of, liturgical catechesis. People are engaged in, unpacking the mystagogy now more than ever. You can look
Yeah.
at the work of someone like a James Pauly or Chris Carstens, right? And the work being put out there in articles in Adoramus Bulletin. They've even republished Romano Guardini's book on liturgical formation, right? I mean, today is
Hmm.
a great time to be, there's an emphasis on liturgical living, right? It's a
Yeah.
great time to study the liturgy and kind of look at uh, these symbols anew, and then experience the liturgy, really for the first time, right, with
Yeah.
eyes wide open.
Yeah.
Um,
No, well, that actually is an excellent segue into this section in your book that I found just really amazing. It's about the theology of beauty in Joseph Ratzinger. Could you unpack that for us, especially today? We're all in the church. There's a lot of division, fighting, and even in the world, and maybe just to taking a break, take a breath, and to contemplate something beautiful. Could you tell us about Ratzinger's theology of
sure.
beauty?
And you've alluded to this, right? I mean, when you ask people to articulate their reasons for why they might like the architecture or the
Hmm.
music or whatever in a particular parish, it's usually expressed in terms of a preference. But
Hmm.
really, what it boils down to is beauty, right? In Sacramentum Caritatis, right?
Hmm.
You know, an underplayed, writing of Pope Benedict
Yeah.
XVI. I mean, there he talks about beauty being the veritatis splendor, right, of the
Yeah.
liturgy. Being, basically, it's an intrinsic uh, essential, right? Beauty is essential. But then the question becomes, well, what makes something beautiful, right? There's the rub, right? I mean, how do we
Yeah.
know that this architecture or this song? Well, something is beautiful, right, to the degree that it actualizes its nature, right? I mean, St. Thomas gives us very criteria of integrity, right,
Integrity, clarity, and
and
harmony.
harmony, right,
Yeah.
consonantia, integritas, right, and so forth.
Yeah.
Um, but with respect to the liturgy, right, I mean, the liturgy is meant to be I mean, on the one hand, it makes present the heavenly banquet, right, the New Jerusalem, right,
Hmm.
all these things, right, and so to the degree in which the architecture or the sacred music or the vesture,
Hmm.
uh, gets us closer to contemplating those, that eschatological end, the more beautiful it is,
Hmm.
versus what we see in practice is people opt for utility, right? They opt for use as opposed
Yeah.
to trying to elevate uh, our senses, right? I mean, when you look at a sanctuary, right, does it call to mind the heavenly Jerusalem, or could it just as easily be an assembly hall or a banquet hall or a Walmart, right? I mean, if that's the case, right?
Yeah.
We've already gone we've gone astray. I mean, the upswing is there's been a lot of renewal and emphasis in the area of sacred architecture and sacred art and
Hmm.
sacred music, right? I mean, that area in particular is a concern of Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, in part because you have that combination of music and word, right? Logos, right?
Hmm.
And the form, right, which is put forth as the model is Gregorian chant, right? I mean,
Hmm.
John Paul II, right? Pope Francis, right? They emphasize our need to, I mean, the Roman liturgy, right, for chant to be normative, but unfortunately in practice it has not been the
Yeah.
case. I mean,
Yeah.
what's great is there are people like Adam Bartlett, right, Source and Summit, right, and others who have made chant accessible, right, for parishes, not just in the Latin, but in the vernacular, right? There's a need to,
Yeah.
the liturgy normatively should be sung, but it's not, right? I mean, Musicum
Hmm.
Sacrum is, the Vatican II document on music that's out there, but not
Yeah.
really not
Read.
really
Yeah.
implemented.
Yeah.
And as far as that chapter on beauty goes, I mean, we should look at all things, right? We should look at our vesture. We should look at our sacred vessels. We should look at our
Hmm.
iconography. And we have this period of Eucharistic revival, right? It would be a good time to take stock at our
Yeah.
parishes and ask ourselves, do our liturgies and all these varying forms of the Ars Celebrandi, do they really reflect the wedding feast of the Lamb? And what are areas we can improve? Right. I mean, what are ways in which we can improve the architecture, the art, the music, right? Whatever the case might be, because the more beautiful something is, the more true it is, right? And
Yeah.
the more true, and then the more attractive it is, right? Beauty is that which is pleasing to the eye. I mean, a good example of this would be if you look at Texas A&M's Catholic Center, St. Mary's, right there. They've undergone a beautiful, renovation of their Catholic center. It really reflects some of these themes we see in, yes, in the theology of Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, but really in the theology of the Church, right? I mean,
Yeah.
to make those heavenly realities present to us. So
Yes. No, I think that was my favorite part of your book was the section on beauty. I thought it was really good. And you talked about kind of, the bunker church or the Walmart church, and to go back to what we've been talking about, it's kind of like that's where you see the logos of pure ethos kind of show up, which is that everything is utilitarian and concerned with how we can affect things in the world and not turn towards the Lord. So there's definitely that's and a lot of people are kind of traumatized from some of that era. But speaking of being traumatized, and I think that we're in the church right now. We're in a new era that is actually very hopeful. Because we have all of these young priests, the seminaries, the liturgical formation, and they are taking the liturgy seriously. I mean, the improvements in liturgical worship are just incredible. I mean, we always have work to do, right? But it's just if you look at the liturgy like 2, 3 decades ago, and you look at it today, it's night and day. And so that personally makes me really hopeful, and that's why videos like this are just to encourage priests, especially, to take to heart, like you said, not just the theology of this or that person, but the theology of the church and the documents of the church, like Desiderio Desideravi or Musicam Sacram and things like that. And that, to me, it's hopeful. It kind of puts behind us a lot of the bitterness and there's a lot of that going around. But moving forward towards the Lord, right? But you brought
yes.
up Adam, you brought up Adam Bartlett, and then also Christopher Karstens as well, and people like Bishop Conley, Clear Creek Abbey in Oklahoma, coming from Funkelbo. I mean, I think here we're seeing the richness that's ahead of us, I think, and a lot of it is thanks to Pope Benedict. I really think so. So that gives me a lot of hope. It makes me really optimistic. But let's see. I wanted to ask you, in light of that, of the hope and of what we've been talking about, what can this conversation teach us about things moving forward? What are maybe some practical applications, tips that you might want to offer the audience?
Sure. I think back to the Ratzinger report, right? The interview of Joseph
Yeah.
Ratzinger. And he was asked. He makes that statement about the greatest apologia or the greatest arguments for
Hmm.
Christianity, and for him, he says it boils down to basically the beauty, in the in our patrimony of sacred artwork, and then the
Hmm.
saints, right? The witness of the saints, right? I mean, I think moving forward, right? I mean, those are the things that we hold on to, right? That the truth has been conveyed in both beauty and in the goodness, the sanctity, and that we can't, we don't just have to be passive spectators, right? But we're called to enter into that narrative, right? That is our
Hmm.
our hope, right? I mean, we
Yeah.
too can be engaged in that larger project of, slitting the world with the beauty and the truth and the goodness of the logos.
Yeah.
And will we necessarily see its fruits in our lifetime? No, but we're called to engage in that work. And I think to your point, I mean, I think we will continue to reap the benefits of, the papacies of John Paul II, right, and Benedict Ratzinger, right? I mean, I think their
Hmm.
ideas will continue to,
Yeah.
to germinate in the priests, bishops, deacons, lay people, right? We'll continue to see that unfold, but the church may grow smaller, right? But she'll be more
Yeah.
more faithful, as Ratzinger wrote in or at least it's been republished in Faith in the Future, right? But that
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
but our hope has a name and a face, right? Christ in the Holy Eucharist. That's what we must never lose sight of, right? But if we continue to, you know, dive deeply into the minds of, of his thought, right, or the mind, right, of Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, right? I mean, I think we will find hope, right? Reasons
Yes.
for hope.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. There's a passage in the Spirit of the Liturgy where he speaks of beauty. He says, "Beauty, in a certain way, wounds us when we're encountered by it, when we're arrested by it, and then it turns it turns us into this kind of flight into the good." It's a passage, and it's a really beautiful passage, and it seems to me that if we allow ourselves to be wounded by beauty, then this flight into the good, in a certain sense, will kind of break open this imminent frame of church politics and anger, right? And we'll be able to kind of transcend it and kind of move beyond these liturgy wars if we allow beauty to do that to us, and where we can actually, actually be, share in a meal together because of the sacrifice of our Lord, which is the logos of all of the activity of the church. And if any Catholic, me, you, anyone watching, the Eucharist isn't just on Sunday, like you said, and then the week is this kind of secular doing thing. No, the Eucharist overflows. It's our life. The Eucharist is our life. And I think, to me, that gives me a lot of hope. And it's why I do, videos like this, and I have people like you on, and I strongly recommend that people get a copy of this, A Living Sacrifice, Liturgy and Eschatology, and Joseph Ratzinger. I recommend people get a copy, read it, and pray with the Theology of Pope Benedict. One of his greatest books on liturgy is The Spirit of the Liturgy, I think. So is there anything else you'd like to add, Dr. Millare, before we close off?
No, I mean, I think I mean, I think it's the only thing that comes to mind is what, and I've already kind of touched upon what Pope Benedict said at World Youth Day in Cologne, right? That
Mm-hmm.
happiness has a name and a face, right? Jesus,
Yeah.
Jesus Nazareth in the Holy Eucharist, right? That's what we need
Mm-hmm.
to never lose sight of, and if we don't lose sight of that and keep our gaze fixed on the face of Christ, right, we won't lose hope.
Amen. Is there anywhere you want to point the audience to find out more about your works, or all those things?
Sure. I mean, you can just simply, look up my name, Roland Millare, right? I mean, but look up the work, especially of For Life and Family, the St. John Paul II Foundation, right? Because the work I do here, right, at the JP2 Foundation is concrete. We serve married couples, healthcare professionals, and clergy. We are continuing to present the gospel, family, the gospel of life, because the future of the church passes via the way of the family, and of course, right. I mean, the question of liturgy is closely connected, and then be on the lookout for that dictionary or
Lexicon,
lexicon
yeah.
on the theology of Joseph Ratzinger. There are 72 different entries in that. I think I hear it's getting closer, but Ignatius Press
Yeah.
will publish the English edition, and it'll be translated into German, Spanish, Portuguese. So it'll be a great.
I'm really looking forward to
Uh,
that. Yeah. Excellent. Well, if you guys have enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. And if you want to support me and not see me end up at McDonald's, consider supporting me at patreon.com/the Logos Project. And Dr. Millare, thanks again for joining us. It was a pleasure talking to you, and we'll see you all next time. God bless.
yes, thanks again, Dom. God bless.